So, Zan, thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to have you as part of this Diabetes Innovators Series that we're doing, the Diabetes Innovation Series here at ADA. What we're going to do to start is just introduce yourself and your title and the company you work for.
Good. Well, Rob, thrilled to be here. It's an honor. I go by Zan, which is short for Alexander. I am an endocrinologist by background and went on to be at FDA for a number of years. But right now, I'm the founder and executive chairman of Kinexum and also the president of Agonists Institute, which we might talk about later on, our pro bono, not-for-profit organization.
Well, Zan, thank you for being here today. And before we hit record, we were kind of talking about when you started at FDA and the sort of changing mindset in the public around diabetes. So let's talk a little bit about that time. You know, in researching you for this series, you worked at the FDA on approving drugs like metformin and statins and other drugs that are widespread today and used by millions of people. How do you, when you think back on those years at FDA, what comes to mind?
Well, I mentioned that at the time that I was first at NIH and then went on to FDA, diabetes was really a backward. And this is about the time you were born. I went up to be at NIH in the early 80s. And then one day somebody asked, actually a colleague of mine from medical school, if I could come up to FDA just to help out because they were really getting busy. Long story short, what I thought would be a sabbatical was a career. But just at this time, we had these landmark studies that were coming out. First, the UK PDS, and then the DCCT, Diabetes Control Complication Trial. And these were the trials that revolutionized diabetes, because up until then, there was debate as to whether it made any difference to control glucose levels. Can you imagine? I mean, incredible, as I've seen, people just let it rip. And of course, you know how it goes when you do that. People take terrible complications. But when I came to FDA, again, thinking it would be a temporary thing, there was really very little for diabetes in general. We had sulfonylurea agents for type 2 diabetes, and we had insulin for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And these were actually not modern insulins that we have now. So I just was luckier than good. I walked into a couple of things. Number one, this major change in how diabetes was looked at, and subsequently an explosion in the development of products for diabetes. And that started with insulin analogs, but it went on to other things. Long story. But I also walked into FDA when it was changing. It was radically changing from also a backwater. It was sort of a place where people who couldn't get a job, any other job, went to find work. And a wonderful opportunity. It was when FDA really started to get its act together. And I walked into the approval of the first step. A lot of the legwork had been done before I got there. But I got a lot of credit for approving the drug. And indeed, I set the all-time record for getting the drug approved at that time, because then drugs typically took 4 years to be approved on average after the new drug application was submitted. So we did it in about 10 months. And it was, again, sheer dumb luck, because I didn't know to do anything different, but just to get it done. And I encouraged my colleagues who were also involved in the review to get it done. And we did.
How do you, in an organization like that, it's sort of at an inflection point, like you said, in the disease state with diabetes and heart disease, and then also in the institution where there's a lot of change, and you sort of as an outsider, not knowing what you don't know, right? You're just kind of pushing forward and manage to get something done at a rate that had never been done before. How did you, in the day-to-day, what did that look like?
Well, of course, in real time, you don't see it happen as fast as you might recall, but it was an exciting time. I knew that this was going to be a huge drug. I didn't have any idea how big the statins would be. Eventually, a good part of the American population would be on one statin or another. And indeed, I even take it myself, even though I don't have any major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. But it was an exciting time because we had these new drugs coming through, not just for managing diabetes, but for managing cardiovascular risk. And there were certainly challenges. We had some very tough periods where we even had to recall the first glitazone that was approved. So it was not totally smooth sailing, but it was a very exciting time. And in part because of that sheer dumb luck of having the first statin with you and doing it in record time, the agency gave me all kinds of opportunities. I was stationed at WHO in Geneva for a year and a half. And that was a life-changing experience for my family. And then the opportunity to represent the agency at various expert working groups globally was another wonderful opportunity. So again, one thing led to another, but it turned out to be a wonderful 12 years that I was there.
You mentioned that at the time when you joined FDA, diabetes was the backwater. It was not in the forefront. It was not thought of or prioritized at the agency. What do you think drove the interest and got us from where we were then 40 years ago to where we are today, here at ADA scientific sessions, the ADA scientific sessions. So, about half of the scientific sessions have taken place before that. Now, more. So what do you think, I don't know, what were the drivers, the catalysts of that at that time?
Well, again, it was having a way of moving the needle and knowing that it made sense to do so. About this time, we also started using hemoglobin A1C as a marker. I hadn't done
So there was no marker before.
Well, you could prick your finger if you really wanted to go to trouble, and very few people did. And you would put it on a strip and you compare it with a piece of paper. Or the way it was often done was just to test your urine. And it was either 1+ or 3+. And if it was 1+, you had a glucose probably 180 at that point. So it was very crude. The A1C itself revolutionized the care of diabetes in general. It gave us a way of approving drugs and doing so with some confidence that there was going to be an improvement in clinical outcomes. Because again, we had both the UKPDS, which was done in type 2 patients, and the DCCT, which was done in type 1 patients. They showed this clear correlation of glycemic control as reflected by A1C complications, cardiovascular complications, even probably cardiovascular complications. So we had the mandate, and then we had the tool, and we started having more and more tools to control glucose. And that started with better insulin analogs. The first insulin analog was Humalog, and that came about from Lilly. And it was a very important addition to the armamentarium. And then later we had the fast-acting insulin analogs. And that was, again, improvement. So we've made a lot of progress. And again, it's because we know why it matters. We know how to make a difference. We have the ability to make a difference. And yet, we're not anywhere near where we need to be. Both for many people and certainly on average, we're just not controlling glucose and other risks the way we want to.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I think you mentioned Humalog, which I still take today, so, still widely used and prescribed. And the mindset shift from we don't know what actual glycemic control will do for your long-term health versus today, not only are we talking about, this year, not only time in range, measuring, time in the range blood sugars on a CGM, but now time in tight range, even taking that to the next phase. And I think some patients have felt that we're moving maybe too fast on that, where it's like, we just got time in range, and that's a measure for me to feel good. It's information, but sometimes can have a little bit of shame associated with it if you're not in the range that you want to be in. And now to even dial it in even more. So what comes to mind for you? Like, why are we not where we should be in even though we've got amazing technology and we've got improved access, we've got better coverage, what are the things what are the obstacles that are preventing us to get?
Well, first of all, it's understandable that folks with diabetes feel worn out and even feel like they can't even keep up with the technology. As you well know, we now have closed loop insulin pump systems. And that's a great advance, but it's also a heck of a lot of work and expense. Not everybody wants to sign up. So that's one of the big problems, that we can get closer and closer to good overall glycemic control, but it takes more and more energy to get that sort of diminishing improvement. And so what drives me is, how do we cure type 1 diabetes? And by cure, I don't mean necessarily that you're totally off insulin, or that you don't have to occasionally check your glucose levels. Imagine not having to worry about hypoglycemia. If you could just take prandials and you hardly ever needed to check blood glucose, imagine what your life would be like.
Yeah, I think, and just the anxiety and mental load coming off of that as well, not having to wonder or have to say, well, I can't go do this spontaneous activity because I've got 80 units of insulin on board.
Yeah. And we're still, even though you're at absolutely great control, knowing that at any point in time, you could wake up in the street having had an episode of severe hypoglycemia. That is the constant threat of anybody who's on insulin, particularly people with type 1 diabetes. And that's what I mean by an effective or a practical cure, is that you treat your diabetes like it were hypothyroidism. You take a little pill every day and you more or less forget it. So that's what we need. We've got a lot of things going in terms of better ways of managing diabetes, but the goal should be to get rid of all the technology, not to have to depend on it, to be able to live a completely normal life.
I personally, and I haven't shared this with the podcast yet, so this will be kind of a student for this episode for listeners who are tapped into that. I'm now taking a new medication for cardio, for my heart, because heart disease runs in my family, and diabetes and heart disease are so closely related. And the medication is a once daily pill, just like my hypothyroidism medication. Really simple. And I had this conversation with my cardiologist. I'm like, well, what's the management? What's the treatment? He's like, oh, just a once daily pill. I said, well, okay, well, I'm managing my type 1 diabetes, and I'm doing, my site changes and my sensor changes and my insulin refills and my carb counting, and I'm really involved in that. And I'm lucky to have the opportunity to get really great results from it. But if all we're doing is adding one more pill to the mix, like, sign me up. Like, that's an easy thing to do when you're as practiced as somebody who's living with type 1 diabetes. So the idea of a once daily pill to do all of the work that we've been doing and that needed all this technology is particularly exciting. It's sort of been, my brain has a hard time comprehending how impactful that would be.
Well, if that drug you've added is an SGLT2 inhibitor, that would be an example of something that we didn't expect. It's a drug that was approved for diabetes, for controlling glucose, and for type 2 patients. But it's been found to be very helpful for preventing heart disease and for controlling even heart failure to get started. Now, the problem is it's not approved in the U.S. for type 1 patients. It's being used off-label a lot, and for good reason. There's plenty of evidence that makes it a reasonable tablet to be taken. But it's not a cure. What we want is you to be able to take a tablet, or it has to be an injection, but one that truly is modifying the entire disease process, so that you've got your own secretion of insulin from the pancreas. And the pancreas is expert in measuring the amount of insulin it puts out. And so you don't get hypoglycemia when you have enough insulin secreting capacity in your pancreas.
It's funny to think about, like, how accurate the pancreas is, in preventing hypoglycemia in just regular.
Well, it's really mind-boggling when you think about it. The insulin secreting beta cells make up just a gram of tissue. I mean, that's hardly anything. And yet they're so important. They make all the difference between a life where you've got to really work at keeping normal and just being able to go after the business and not worry about your weight.
Yeah, it never occurred to me how small they actually make up of it.
It's just a couple of percent of the weight of the pancreas. I mean, it's just an incredibly small amount of tissue. The thyroid gland is much, much larger.
So I want to, before we close on and move out to the next topic and close on this FDA timeframe, I'd always wondered, like, what would surprise patients, people with diabetes, about like what it's like behind the scenes of approving drugs and reviewing the data and the testing and the rigor that goes.
People would be amazed. In fact, I would like to work with you someday to produce a series on the drug approval process.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Because people would be amazed. It's more like the man or the human space shot than anything else. It just takes literally thousands of people. Now, FDA is the tip of the iceberg, but to get that evidence, as you know, takes a lot of investigation, starting out with simple studies and people about the disease, and then going through this process where for diabetes drugs, you typically need 4,000 to 10,000 people that are exposed to the drug for up to 2 or 3 years. And that in itself is a huge amount of work and money on the order. But at the FDA receiving it, I think people would really be astounded at the number of people who are involved. And it's not just doctors who are looking at the clinic data. It's people who understand the manufacturing and the analytical procedures, the testing that has to occur in animals and other ways. Just roughly speaking, I would say when a drug is approved, there are literally hundreds of people who touch that application in one way or the other. Now, it'll come out of like my pharma division, which has on the order of 150 people. And on a NDA review, there might be a dozen or so people from that division involved, but there are many others, disciplines that are arcane, you wouldn't even know they exist, that have to do with making sure the product is not just effective, but it's safe, and that you can count on the quality of the product. And then there are all sorts of people who look at the labeling of the drug, make sure that it really is compliant with the standards of labeling. And so the point is, people would be amazed at all that is involved in getting a single drug approved. And that's not talking about all the people who were involved from the first time it goes into it.
Right. And I mean, I think that's something that I had to learn. And I'll take you up on that, like songs about it, because I think it's so surprising. And then it makes sense too. I think on one hand, as a patient, there's a new iPhone every year and it's, it pushes things forward. It's like, well, 5 years ago, my incredibly expensive insulin pump still had a Game Boy screen, calculator screen on it. It's like, well, how can I keep up? But then there's so much safety and there's so much testing. It has to, be able to work through a very different populations and be safe ultimately. So I think it would be very cool to see behind the scenes of that.
I'd love to do that.
You, as I'm researching, you have a term called Meta-Abesity that I'd like to talk a little bit about. And it refers to a study, sort of a hobby of mine, of studying the main killers of the US public, which cancer, heart disease, diabetes, neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia. And the likelihood that your average person in the US has an 80% chance of dying from one of those, or a combination. So talk a little bit about your work in longevity and like what innovations are you and your peers coming upon in your work?
Well, this is a passion of mine, Rob. I've been out at the agency for about 10 years. I was operating my firm, helping typically small companies, but also supporting big companies to develop their products. And it just dawned on me, why are we putting so much effort in just managing diseases? And why not prevent them? Put more effort into prevention. And then I came to realize that all the major chronic diseases, not just diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but even neurodegenerative disease, dementia, of course, and Parkinson's, and even cancer are driven by the same root causes. Some of the same, they differ in the degree that these drivers are responsible. But the point is, there is this neuroscience hypothesis that all these diseases are driven by shared root causes. And if we can treat or deal with the root causes, we can actually help to reduce the risk of multiple chronic diseases. And this actually ties in with aging biology, the notion that if you can reduce age-related chronic diseases, you can actually bend the aging process. And so that's become my passion. And I did coin the term Meta-Abesity to refer to all these chronic diseases. It's not just an elaborate form of obesity or diabetes. Meta-Abesity refers to all these chronic diseases and cancer that do share these root causes. Now, we more recently evolved towards talking about healthy longevity or increasing health span.
Very popular right now.
And the reason is, first, for a couple of reasons. Meta-Abesity could be confusing. Some people thought it was just talking about metabolic syndrome or just some form of obesity. But no, what we're trying to do is to increase health span. That is, the period of life free of these chronic diseases and disabilities. And that's really what I think people are interested in. I don't think people are so interested in just living longer if it's going to mean living with chronic diseases and having poor quality of life. So we put the emphasis on health span, and that can be defined as even a clinical endpoint for trials that could be designed to show that health span is actually increased. But also, it just makes sense for people to embrace the idea of, let's avoid having diabetes, dementia for as long as I can.
Yeah, the idea of living better longer, not just focusing on living longer.
Yeah. So we use the term targeting healthy longevity or increasing health span. And so that led to our, first of all, putting a conference on, going back to the first one in 2017. And we did that in London, of all things. But we came back to the US and got the thing going. It was very successful. And then the pandemic came and we went virtual. And that has led to our putting on sessions every 4 to 8 weeks throughout the year. And the hallmark of our sessions is that we bring people together from diverse disciplines. We call it silent busting. And that's much needed because the people in the neuroscience world don't tend to mix with people in the diabetes world.
Very vertical.
They are. And it's almost amazing. It's like two parallel universes. So that's something we try to change. And not just scientific disciplines, but we bring other important aspects, economics, reimbursement, the things that are needed to ultimately make an environment where there will be investment in innovation, success, and finding ways of helping people like you, not me, because I'm over the point of probably benefiting, but you, Rob, to have a greater health span. And just as an example, that could be something like one of the well-known GLP-1 agonists.
Right.
Now, the problem is these agents do have downside. We know that they decrease muscle mass density, and this is an issue that's being dealt with right here at ADA.
You mentioned earlier about SGLT2 inhibitors being used for people with type 1 diabetes. There's research coming out at this conference about the GLP-1s. We're going to have someone as part of the series talking a little bit about that.
Well, that's one of the things I'm going to be very interested in seeing, because I do think there is a role for GLP-1 agonists in people with type 1 diabetes, for sure, because unfortunately, many people with type 1 take on type 2 as they get older, as they use insulin more and more, weight gain because of using insulin, which itself, when used as an injected form, tends to cause weight gain. So it's that vicious cycle.
Hormone.
Yeah, and so this is something you obviously do a good job with
Well, I have a lot of genetic and lifestyle factors working in my favor, but I think, for someone that the first time it really occurred to me was one of my friends who was younger than me, but had had diabetes for much longer. And her ability to absorb insulin and her insulin sensitivity was very low. And so because her body had been used to, and she often had to switch brands to try to help with that. So when I think of, well, a GLP-1 agonist would help her be more insulin absorbent, insulin sensitive, so she could use less insulin to keep her sugar in range, and then reverse that feedback loop of the insulin causing.
Well, anybody who has a significant weight problem is a candidate for GLP-1 agonists, whether they have type 1 diabetes. And so type 1 patients should not be deprived of using it. They can benefit from that standpoint alone. By reducing weight, you will reduce insulin resistance. That will help you to have better long-term outcomes in managing your type 1 diabetes. But for people who are young and are not overweight, there's a question, is there a role for GLP-1 agonists? Would they help to promote beta cell function or recovery? Is there some long-term benefit from that direction that they could be helping? Maybe not to fully reverse the loss of beta cells, but there is reason to believe that there is going to be at least kind of a tailwind on beta cells by having GLP-1 agonists on board. So this is a prospect. The GLP-1 agonists could have more of a role than just controlling weight. They could have more of a role for healthy people in general, even before they become overweight. It's conceivable that if we can manage the downside effects, like on the bone and on muscle, that they could help people with a variety of things, even addiction. As you know, there's evidence that these agents help with things that are upstairs.
It's really fascinating. I think and the more that we are able to study it, and that's something I'm learning too. Like I told you earlier, this is my 5th scientific sessions over a number of years. The first year the drug gets approved, and then the next year you see the first year of research, and then the following year there's even more. And so I think with, specifically GLP-1, now that it's so widespread, it's approved for so many different, whether it's obesity or kidney or liver, working on type 1 diabetes. It's exciting. I do want to ask you, and I don't know how you may not be able to answer this exactly right, but so if you were thinking from a longevity building health span perspective, what would your ideal pharmacological lifestyle or supplement protocol for someone? What would you, and there's so many myriad of factors that would go into that, but what would you think if you were to just sketch something?
Well, today, what we know is that it makes a big difference on how well you manage your glucose and other metabolic measures. So that's a no-brainer. You just gotta do what you have to do to control glucose. But then what do you do on top of that, particularly you with your life ahead of you? What other things could be helpful to increase your health span? I would say GLP-1 agonists look like a potential net benefit. We don't have the long-term evidence we need, but it's not crazy to be thinking about taking that, particularly if you have other reasons to take it, and that would be to basically improve your cardiovascular risk.
Yeah.
It's a stepwise progression of things that you can do, but they're based on increasingly less evidence. And that's why we're here today.
Right.
To talk about evidence from doing things or trying these things, not jumping to conclusions and taking medicines that may ultimately turn out to be unhealthy.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to see, how fast those things are moving, and, being able to be here and have access to the presentations and the research early on, the posters even of just start with ideas and hypotheses, and then they work their way into,
But I would say, Ron, that as fast as things seem to be moving, it takes a long time. For example, the first GLP-1 agonist was approved in the early 2000s by Ada, and it was just approved for glucose management. But then it was later on that liraglutide, a longer acting GLP-1 agonist was approved first for glucose lowering, but it was the first agent to be approved for weight loss. And so it was a GLP-1 agonist, but nobody was excited about it. Not many people were using it. It was only relatively recently that we got semaglutide and tirzepatide. And now they squeeze the oxygen out of the air. It's the biggest therapeutic class in terms of market size in human history. And so you might think, well, things have just accelerated, and in a sense they are, but it also just, I want to point out, it took 20 years before we got here. And we started out with this drug class beginning in the early 2000s, and now we're seeing finally where we've got what seem to be silver bullets, at least in some ways, for controlling weight and glucose.
It's a really fascinating way to look at it. It's timing in everything is such a big part of it.
Yeah.
It's got to be the right time.
Yeah, and it's also sheer dumb luck, because I never would have thought that SGLT2 inhibitors would be much of a thing, even for diabetes. As it turned out, not only is it a great way to control glucose, but as you know, we now know that it improves cardiovascular outcomes. So we just never know how things are going to go. And again, it comes back to we got to get the evidence. Yeah, and that takes a long time, a lot longer and more expensively than we'd like to do the case.
We do. As we kind of close, I do have one question, a little crazy one. I want to hear. I imagine that there were some pitches or some proposals that came across your desk at the FDA. Or let's just call them memorable. What's the most memorable, maybe outside the box?
I have so many memories, but a specific one that stands out was in those days, we didn't have this formality where you submitted a meeting request. It took 72 days to actually have the meeting. People could just walk into my office. And of course, that's no longer the case at FDA either. One day, a gentleman from an Eastern European country came in and said he had a cure for diabetic ulcers. And I said, well, wow, that's great. Tell me more. And he said, well, I've actually brought it right here with me. And he took a jar out of a paper bag, and it had this commission. And he said, well, this is it. We have formulated this product, and it really works. And long story short, it didn't go very far, if at all. But it stands out as one case where there was a disconnect between sort of the thought that you could just do anything and get it approved.
Walk it right in the door and put it on your desk.
So that does stand out. That's a wild case.
I like it. Zan, thank you, man. Thank you for being here. It was great to meet you.
Yeah.
You're a great interview as well. You got a great voice for it. And yeah, thank you for being out here and being part of the Diabetes Innovators Series on diabetics doing things. And look forward to the next time we can have you on.
I look forward to that prevention.
We're recording now, so we got to make it happen.